Inside the U.S. Capitol, Jasmine Crockett and Marjorie Taylor Greene clash in a fiery hearing over explosive allegations of election data manipulation across swing states. Greene storms in, armed with rage and rehearsed lies, determined to control the narrative, but just minutes later, Crockett flips the narrative with undeniable evidence that stuns the entire chamber. Emails, whistleblower testimony, and a single leaked video turn the spotlight and the pressure back on Greene. If someone this powerful could get away with burying the truth for so long, how many others are still doing it in plain sight? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Inside the marbled walls of the Rayburn House office building, the air was already electric. Word had spread like wildfire that a special congressional hearing was being convened, classified as urgent, with the label National Election Integrity at Risk stamped across the agenda in red. The topic? Allegations of widespread disinformation campaigns targeting swing states in the lead-up to the last election. Whispers in the hallway suggested it would be a routine exchange of partisan soundbites, a media spectacle with little consequence. But behind the ornate double doors of room 2141, something else entirely was brewing. Jasmine Crockett, usually assigned to backbench commentary, had just been announced as the primary examiner, replacing a more junior Democrat at the last minute. No one saw it coming. Even members of her own party exchanged raised eyebrows. To the public, it looked like an error in scheduling. But to those who had followed Crockett's career closely, it was something else. The calm before a calculated storm. Marjorie Taylor Greene arrived late, as if by design. Dressed in white, flanked by cameras and sycophants, she smiled with that signature mix of charm and provocation. She believed, without a doubt, that she was about to dominate the room. She'd faced off against Democrats before and crushed them with memes and manufactured outrage. Today would be no different, she thought, especially not against Crockett, who Greene had once publicly called a race-baiting footnote in a party desperate for diversity optics. Greene took her seat slowly, eyes sweeping the room like a general surveying a battlefield she already owned. She didn't know, and no one else in the chamber knew, that Jasmine Crockett had been planning this moment for months, silently compiling records, internal leaks, whistleblower statements, and forensic digital evidence. She had watched, waited, and endured, while Greene's attacks grew louder and her influence more dangerous. Today wasn't a debate. It was an ambush wrapped in the rule of law. And Jasmine was done playing defense. And then, the moment shifted, like a gust of wind slamming a door shut. The quiet suspense that had lingered in the chamber cracked open as Marjorie Taylor Greene stood and claimed the floor with the confidence of someone who had never once questioned her own spotlight. Her heels echoed against the polished wood as she approached the microphone, posture rigid, eyes scanning for cameras before locking onto her target. The truth itself. She didn't wait for formalities. She didn't care for decorum. Her voice, sharp and slicing, cut through the hush like a serrated blade. "The American people have been lied to," she barked, her southern drawl amplified by the acoustics of the high-ceiling room. The Democrat machine didn't just manipulate the media. They rewrote the facts, twisted the law, and weaponized your tax dollars against your vote. She punctuated the accusation with a pointed jab at the air. Theatrics rehearsed, calculated. Behind her, staffers rolled out a presentation labeled 17 Proven Incidents of Election Fraud Suppression, a wall of headlines, half-redacted documents, and shaky video stills, none peer-reviewed, none authenticated. The sources? Obscure political blogs, self-recorded testimonies, quotes from election volunteers tied to openly partisan organizations. Yet Greene spoke as if every frame were a final verdict. She thrived on the echo chamber. Each pause she took allowed the murmurs of agreement from her base to swell into rhythm. Outside the chamber doors, the chant had begun. "Stop the steal." A crowd of Greene loyalists, waving flags and signs with conspiracy slogans, filled the Capitol's South Plaza. Some were live streaming. Others pressed their ears to the heavy oak doors as if they could will her words into history. Inside, Greene fed off it. She turned once to the gallery, lips curling into a smirk, nodding at supporters like a preacher whose sermon was working. Cameras flashed, desperate to capture her in the perfect pose. One hand on the microphone, the other holding up what she claimed was an internal memo from a Pennsylvania polling station, folded dramatically and brandished like an indictment. "These are your smoking guns," she said, voice trembling with practiced outrage. "And today, they will be heard." But near the end of the bench, Jasmine Crockett remained utterly still, unblinking, unbothered. While Greene threw fuel on the fire, Jasmine kept her focus not on the speaker, but on the stack of files resting neatly beside her. She wasn't surprised. She'd seen this strategy before. Build a wall of noise, overwhelm the facts with volume, replace substance with spectacle. Yet she did not interrupt. She didn't shift in her seat or reach for the microphone. She waited, precise, patient. Not because she didn't have a response, but because she knew Greene wasn't aware of what was coming next. Jasmine's silence wasn't submission, it was strategy. Her expression, calm but unreadable, gave away nothing but a faint, almost imperceptible smile. A knowing one. Because while Greene was putting on a show, Jasmine had already written the ending. She watched Greene perform, watched her spin misinformation into theater, and said nothing. Not yet. Because Jasmine knew something Marjorie didn't. This wasn't Greene's show. Not anymore. Every lie she shouted, every evidence she paraded, was another brick being laid in the trap Jasmine had spent months building. And when it snapped shut, it wouldn't just silence Greene. It would expose the entire machinery behind her performance. And just like that, the room changed. The clamor of Greene's theatrics dissolved into a heavy silence, not the kind born from exhaustion, but anticipation, like a courtroom seconds before a verdict. The performance was over. The oxygen shifted. Cameras readjusted their focus. Staffers leaned in. Everyone knew instinctively that something was about to happen, but few could tell what. And at the center of it all sat Jasmine Crockett, composed, steady, unmoved by the spectacle that had come before. She didn't reach for grand gestures or stack papers in defiance. She didn't need to. Her silence wasn't absence, it was calculation. And in that silence was a power that could not be staged. Then, without raising her voice or breaking the rhythm of her breath, she leaned forward. Her eyes locked on Greene, not with rage, not even with disdain, but with precision. And she asked the kind of question that doesn't get asked unless you already know the answer. "Representative Greene," she said, voice low and crisp, "did your office knowingly suppress contradictory evidence related to these cases?" The effect was immediate, though subtle. Greene didn't stumble, not outright, but her body reacted before her words could cover for it. A flicker in her eye, a tightening of her jaw, a blink that came a half-second too late. For a moment, it was as if time paused around her, exposing every micro-expression in high definition. She let out a short breath through her nose, part scoff, part stall, and tilted her head in the classic posture of political dismissal. "Absolutely not," she said louder than necessary, as though volume could mask unease. "I don't even know what you're referring to." The words landed, but not with confidence. More like a hand slamming a door that won't lock. Around the room, people exchanged glances. Not with conviction, but curiosity. Jasmine hadn't accused. She hadn't insulted. She had simply planted a question, one that hit like a charge waiting for detonation. It was no longer about performance. It was about truth. And everyone could feel it. Something had cracked open, and Jasmine wasn't done pulling. And in that fragile pause after Greene's denial, Jasmine struck. Not with fury, but with finality. There was no change in her tone, no shift in posture, no dramatic buildup. Only the stillness of someone who knew she didn't need noise to command the room. She turned slightly toward the committee technician, and in a voice steady enough to cut glass, said, "Display screen, please." It wasn't a request. It was the flipping of a switch. The overhead monitors buzzed softly as they powered on, illuminating the chamber with cold white light. The image that appeared was plain at first. An ordinary government email interface. No highlight, no blinking arrow, just lines of text. But then, as the words came into focus, the energy in the room changed. Faces stiffened, spines straightened, phones lowered, and there it was. A sentence so naked in intent, it didn't need interpretation. Delete that section. If it leaks, we lose control of the narrative. The email's sender, emblazoned at the top in bold. Marjorie.Greene@mail.house.gov. The recipient, her senior communications advisor. The subject line, Swing State Affidavits. Final draft for public release. There was no ambiguity, no room for spin. It wasn't a misquote. It wasn't out of context. It was a direct written command, a deliberate instruction to remove information that could damage a public story. The kind of instruction that, if proven true, didn't just raise questions about political ethics. It struck at the integrity of congressional oversight itself. The gallery fell into a stunned, suspended silence. Even members who had entered the room firmly in Greene's corner now sat stone-faced, eyes glued to the screen, unwilling, or unable, to look her way. The only sound was the faint whir of the ceiling fan overhead. Greene didn't speak. For the first time in the hearing, she had no words. Her confident posture sagged just enough to betray her. Her lips parted, searching for a response that wouldn't come. She blinked once, then again, slower this time, as though trying to process what she was seeing with everyone else. Behind her, aides began frantically tapping on their phones, not to prepare notes, but to confirm the worst. This wasn't a leak. This wasn't fake. It was real, and it was public. Jasmine, meanwhile, didn't move. She didn't turn to the crowd, didn't raise her voice, didn't follow up with a triumphant monologue. She simply looked at Greene, her face calm, almost serene, and let the evidence speak for itself. Because this wasn't about political vengeance. It wasn't about winning a point. It was about truth finally being louder than the lies it had been buried under. And Jasmine Crockett, long dismissed as a firebrand or a headline hunter, had just proven that the most powerful weapon in the room wasn't a microphone or a camera. It was proof. And as the damning sentence still lingered on the chamber screens, Jasmine leaned in, not to escalate, but to peel back another layer of the lie. The silence wasn't just deep now. It was oppressive, a stillness born not from confusion, but realization. This was no longer about winning an argument. This was about truth finally pulling itself into the light. Without raising her voice, without glancing at the cameras now trained squarely on her, Jasmine spoke with the weight of someone who had been doubted too long and had nothing left to prove. This wasn't an isolated directive, she said, the words firm but calm, like a judge reading a verdict. Let's look at the full thread. The screen flickered once more. What followed wasn't sensational. It didn't need to be. A simple string of internal emails appeared, unremarkable in format, devastating in substance. Subject line, Arizona Data Review, Urgent. Dated 2 weeks before Greene's televised appearance on a national morning show, where she declared the Arizona vote statistically impossible without fraud. Now the contradiction was in black and white. The first message came from a policy advisor in Greene's own office, an understated warning cloaked in bureaucracy. These figures invalidate 2/3 of the affidavit quotes we're preparing to reference, recommending a pause before release. The staffer had cross-verified precinct-level data with public records and raised a red flag. That flag was ignored. Jasmine paused, not for effect, but for dignity, and then advanced to the next email. This one was shorter, colder, and crystal clear. Greene's reply, digitally signed, time-stamped, and sourced directly from her house server. We can't afford that right now. Remove the Arizona references, keep the narrative intact, focus on Georgia. The final phrase wasn't just damning, it was surgical. It revealed intent, not just to bend the truth, but to engineer it. A conscious decision to delete inconvenient facts and reinforce a fabricated frame for public consumption. This time no one moved. No side comments, no procedural interjections. The chamber was no longer a political stage. It had become a crime scene. Even Greene, once brash and unshakable, now stared straight ahead, as if hoping to vanish into the dark mahogany of her desk. The gallery, packed with staffers and media, sat suspended in that awful quiet that only follows certainty. A congressman from her own party shifted uncomfortably and looked down. Members of the Democratic side no longer wore expressions of vindication, but of gravity. The weight of what had just been revealed settled across the room like dust in a vault long unopened. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't blink. She didn't look at Greene. Her gaze remained steady, not as a woman hungry for political points, but as one who had waited too long to be heard, finally speaking not louder, but clearer than the storm of deception around her. For months, she had been cast as the one making noise. Today, with nothing more than a sequence of emails and a steady voice, she had become the signal through all the noise. And just when it seemed the silence couldn't grow heavier, when every breath in the chamber felt rationed and every glance between lawmakers more cautious than the last, Jasmine reached for the final weapon in her arsenal. Not a document, not an affidavit, but something that could not be spun, diluted, or hidden behind legalese. Truth caught on tape. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean forward dramatically or cue the technicians with flair. Instead, her words were simple, stripped of ornament, yet weighted with irreversible consequence. The committee should also be aware of this recording. A low murmur fluttered through the hearing room, whispers of uncertainty, even skepticism. What else could she possibly have? Greene had already been backed into a corner with emails, threads, instructions to manipulate data. But this was something different. The monitors around the room dimmed, then flickered to life again, the same sterile interface replaced now by the choppy resolution of a phone-recorded video. The audio buzzed faintly, the image was unpolished, but the figures in the frame were unmistakable. A long rectangular table, 12 chairs filled with campaign staff, and at the head, her posture unmistakable, even in low quality. Marjorie Taylor Greene. There was no editing, no music, no voiceover or sensational cut. Just a quiet, candid moment from behind closed doors, time-stamped just 3 days before Greene had delivered her now infamous Georgia press conference, where she claimed overwhelming evidence of fraud and urged state officials to decertify the lie. In the video, Greene was speaking to her team, holding a highlighter in one hand and a printed stack of talking points in the other. Her tone was flat, routine even, but her words struck like gunfire in a closed hall. This isn't about truth. This is about winning. And to win, we have to control the information. The entire room inhaled as one, but no sound followed. Just the flickering image on the screen and the reverberation of a phrase no amount of damage control could soften. Jasmine remained still, her arms folded neatly before her, her gaze never breaking from the screen. Not because she needed to see it again, but because everyone else needed to see it for the first time. They needed to feel what she had felt the first time she watched it alone in her office. Heart pounding, realization setting in that this wasn't just dishonesty, it was a strategy. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of confusion, it was recognition of something so deliberate, so coldly calculated, that even seasoned lawmakers found themselves momentarily unmoored. A few glanced at each other across party lines, not in collusion, but in unspoken understanding. This wasn't rhetoric. This was intent, one that crossed ethical boundaries, procedural lines, and for some, moral thresholds. In the second row, Representative Mark Wilkins, a conservative from Nebraska, known more for his loyalty than his conscience, removed his earpiece slowly. The act itself was unremarkable, but in a room trained to read body language like battlefield signals, it was seismic. He turned slightly toward the chairman, his face pale but composed, and spoke with a voice that had once defended Greene in countless subcommittee hearings. "Mr. Chairman," he said, his throat dry, almost hesitant, "I request to be excused. This disrespects the integrity of this process." The words didn't fall. They landed. Hard. There was no performative outrage, no grandstanding, just the quiet, fractured voice of a man realizing that the line had not just been crossed, it had been obliterated. The chairman, stunned but composed, nodded silently. Wilkins stood, adjusted his tie, and walked out. The soft click of his shoes against the tile floor, louder than anything Greene had said since the hearing began. And in that moment, the illusion shattered. For months, Jasmine had been painted by Greene's allies and media pundits as everything from too emotional to dangerously partisan. She was called dramatic, divisive, and obsessed with her own image. She was interrupted, dismissed, and openly mocked in earlier hearings, especially when challenging Greene's version of election integrity. But now that the words were Greene's own, unedited and unfiltered, there was no one left in the room who could claim this was political theater. Because theater implies fiction. And what had just played on that screen was reality in its ugliest, most unvarnished form. Some members on the Republican side shifted uncomfortably. Others whispered among themselves, trying to process what had just happened, trying to calculate whether distancing themselves now would be perceived as weakness or wisdom. But what no one could deny was that something irreversible had taken place in those few seconds of grainy footage. The myth of Greene's authenticity had imploded. The idea that she was simply fighting for her voters collapsed under the weight of her own voice, admitting she was fighting for control, not facts. And Jasmine? She didn't gloat. There was no fist pump, no smirk, no whispered "got her" to an aide. She didn't need that. What she had needed, what she had fought for, was truth. And now it was public. She let the moment breathe. Let the gravity of it settle into the skin of every lawmaker in the room. This wasn't about optics. It was about accountability. And for the first time in months, the weight of that word no longer sat solely on her shoulders. As the video faded to black and the screen returned to the congressional seal, Jasmine finally looked up, not at Greene, who sat motionless now, her lips pressed tight, her knuckles white against the table, but at the chairman. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm and resolute, the echo of someone who had no more need for volume, only clarity. "I have no further remarks at this time." And with that, she leaned back, folded her notes, and waited. Not for praise, not for applause, but for justice to catch up with what had just been revealed. Because in those 10 seconds of footage, Jasmine Crockett had done what months of hearings, hundreds of headlines, and hours of partisan spin could not. She had stripped away the theater. She had shown the machinery behind the curtain, and in doing so, she had turned the tide, not just of a hearing, but of a national conversation. And still, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The truth had spoken loud enough. And as the final frame of the leaked video dissolved into the stark blue and gold seal of the House Oversight Committee, the ripple didn't end within the hearing room. It exploded far beyond it. Jasmine Crockett, still seated with the same deliberate poise, had not even moved on to her next sentence when the outside world began to rupture. It was as if the oxygen in every newsroom across America had been pulled tight into one singular moment of reckoning. At first, it was just a soft tremor, an alert on a producer's desk, a blinking notification in the CNN control room. But within minutes, it was total disruption, the kind that sends anchors scrambling for earpieces and throws entire broadcast schedules out the window. CNN interrupted their panel on international trade mid-sentence. MSNBC cut away from a climate crisis segment. Even Fox News, Greene's long-perceived safe haven, froze a live debate on immigration to flash a banner across the screen in urgent red. "Breaking House Oversight Hearing rocked by leaked Greene video." Studio lights shifted. Phones rang without pause in green rooms. Senior editors barked orders down hallways. Teleprompters were wiped and replaced in real time with rewritten scripts. On-air personalities who had spent months downplaying Jasmine's claims now found themselves in stunned recalibration. The footage was playing on loop across every feed. Every syllable Greene had uttered, "This isn't about truth. This is about winning," was being dissected second by second. And as the video played, a shift occurred not only in media tone, but in narrative control. Jasmine, who had once been labeled unhinged by pundits and shrill by critics, was now at the center of a media firestorm, not of her own making, but her own revealing. Reporters raced to confirm the source of the video, the authenticity of the emails, the chain of custody for every shred of evidence she had introduced. And every confirmation came back the same: verified, time-stamped, watertight. In the New York Times editorial suite, a senior political correspondent leaned back in his chair, stared at the unfolding scene, and muttered under his breath, "She did it. She actually did it." Within 10 minutes, he would post a breaking thread that would garner millions of views. The Greene tapes, what they mean, and why Jasmine Crockett just changed the game. On-air legacy anchors who had once regarded Crockett with mild condescension were now speaking her name with a tone usually reserved for courtroom legends. A clip of the email, "Delete that section. If it leaks, we lose control of the narrative," flashed across split screens. On one side, Greene's face frozen mid-denial. On the other, Jasmine's quiet, composed posture as the evidence spoke for itself. Then came the moment that crystallized it all. At precisely 1:47 p.m. Eastern Time, during a live CNN analysis segment, veteran journalist Karen Lott, a respected figure with over 3 decades covering Washington scandal, turned to the camera with a look that telegraphed both awe and alarm. "I've covered Watergate. I've covered Iran-Contra," she said. "But this is the first time I've seen someone so high profile be undone by their own words so completely, and in real time." She paused for effect, then added, "Today might be the end of Marjorie Taylor Greene's congressional career." That sentence hit the country like a thunderclap. It wasn't just speculation. It was a formal pronouncement from a journalist with nothing to gain and everything to protect. Social media ignited instantly. The hashtag #Greene collapse trended globally within 7 minutes. Screenshots of the video circulated with meme captions like, "Not about truth, we noticed." On TikTok, clips of Jasmine's expressionless gaze as Greene unraveled had already become a viral soundbite. She didn't blink, she didn't move, she just let the truth burn. Meanwhile, in the hearing room, Jasmine continued her presentation. Not hurried, not panicked, not even celebratory. She moved from slide to slide, document to document, with the calm of someone who had been preparing for this day for months, knowing that each revelation would bring her closer to a moment long denied to her. Vindication, not just in fact, but in history. Yet even as the news broke outside, Jasmine remained grounded in something deeper than optics. This wasn't about headlines. It was about the weight of injustice she had carried for months, about being dismissed as too aggressive, too partisan, too loud, while Greene was allowed to dominate the airwaves with narratives crafted in back rooms and fed to a willing base. She had watched the country bend around carefully sculpted lies while being told to wait her turn, moderate her tone, or accept the rules of a game that was never written for her. But she didn't play the game. She rewrote it, document by document, email by email, until it could no longer be ignored. And now, as networks raced to catch up with a reality she had uncovered piece by piece, Jasmine didn't change her rhythm. She didn't pause for the cameras. She didn't nod to the news breaking across every screen. She simply turned to her next point, clicking to the next slide, letting the country finally realize what she had always known. The truth, when held tightly enough, doesn't need to shout to shatter everything around it. Outside, a storm of narratives erupted. Political analysts scrambled to recast alliances. Fundraisers canceled events. Campaign consultants unplugged phones. But inside that hearing room, Jasmine Crockett stood alone. Not in isolation, but in clarity. She had stood in the storm, weathered every smear, every eye roll, every editorial dismissal. And now the winds had shifted, and she was still standing, exactly where she was always meant to be. And as the media firestorm tore through Washington like a breach in the dam of controlled narrative, the aftershocks began to hit Marjorie Taylor Greene's inner circle with surgical precision. What had begun as a defense of patriotism and election truth was now crumbling into something far less noble, a collapse of credibility that no spin doctor could salvage. Inside her office, where only hours earlier aides had buzzed with arrogance and self-assured whispers, the mood had shifted into a suffocating silence. Phones rang unanswered. Staffers avoided eye contact. By 4:17 p.m., just 3 hours after Jasmine Crockett had finished speaking, the first breach in Greene's armor came from within. Her senior communications advisor, the same recipient of the infamous email, "Delete that section. If it leaks, we lose control of the narrative," submitted a handwritten letter of resignation. 2 paragraphs, no excuses. Just one line that would be quoted on every major network by sundown. "I was not elected to help bury the truth." Minutes later, her chief legal strategist followed suit. this time with a digital statement emailed to the House clerk and CCCED to several journalists. I was not aware that materials provided to Congress were incomplete or misrepresented. I can no longer serve in good conscience. The news broke like glass across Greene's already shattered platform. Fox News, hesitant until now to fully abandon her, ran a chyron that read simply, "Key Greene staffers resign, psyched integrity concerns." Across the Capitol, members of both parties sat in stunned disbelief. Not because Greene was exposed, many had suspected as much, but because her once loyal insiders had abandoned her mid-battle. And they hadn't gone quietly. They'd walked out the front door with the truth in their hands. But the damage didn't stop with resignations. By early evening, two of the witnesses Greene had heavily leaned on in her public claims came forward, voluntarily and visibly shaken. One, a former election volunteer from Pima County, Arizona, had previously been quoted in Greene's materials as stating he had personally seen discarded ballots marked for Republican candidates. But standing outside the hearing chamber with his attorney, he delivered a different account to the press. "I never said that. What I did say was that I overheard conflicting instructions, but my quote was manipulated, taken out of context, and framed as firsthand observation. That's not what happened." The second, a retired cybersecurity analyst, held up a printed packet. The same affidavit Greene had submitted to the committee, only the version he had originally signed included 3 full paragraphs omitted from the public version. One of those paragraphs, according to him, expressly cautioned against drawing conclusions without full access to the voting machines. Yet that caution was removed. The revelations struck with surgical weight. This was no longer just about Greene's conduct. It was about the intentional construction of a false foundation and using it to launch a national investigation. Jasmine, who had once been cast as a disruptor, a contrarian, a partisan voice trying to derail Greene's quest for truth, was now revealed as the only person in the room who had actually sought it. The contrast was brutal, and it was inescapable. As night fell over Capitol Hill and the city's skyline blinked with breaking news alerts from every rooftop studio, the chairman of the House Oversight Committee emerged from a closed-door emergency session. His face was pale, jaw locked, his steps slow. Cameras panned in. Microphones were raised. The statement he delivered would change everything. In light of recent developments, including the emergence of contradictory testimony, the resignation of senior staff, and clear inconsistencies in submitted evidence, I am ordering an immediate suspension of the current investigation pending a full forensic audit of all materials provided by Representative Greene's office. Gasps from the press corps were audible. Not whispers, gasps. Because this wasn't just a procedural pause. It was a formal acknowledgement of possible fraud within a congressional investigation. It meant that Greene was no longer just politically wounded. She was now under scrutiny by the very institutions she had tried to weaponize. And while the chairman spoke, Jasmine Crockett stood quietly in the shadowed hallway just beyond the podium. She wasn't the focus of the cameras now, but she didn't need to be. Her work was already radiating through every corridor of that building, through every news ticker, every headline, every phone call from donors reconsidering their loyalties. For months, she had been accused of obstruction, called dramatic, told to wait her turn. But as staffers quit, witnesses recanted, and the investigation itself crumbled under the weight of its own falsehoods, it became undeniable. Jasmine Crockett had never been the problem. She had always been the warning, and now, too late for some, she had become the reckoning. And while the chairman's voice still echoed down the marble halls and the nation reeled from the announcement of the investigation's suspension, the most revealing moment of the day wasn't caught on a broadcast. It happened in a shadowed corner of power, away from cameras, away from decorum. As staffers and security shuffled through the West Corridor, clearing space for a recess before the committee reconvened, Jasmine Crockett stepped into the quiet, her folder pressed to her chest, her face unreadable. The hallway smelled faintly of printer toner and freshly brewed coffee, mundane reminders of government machinery still grinding despite the seismic rupture. It was here in the stillness of bureaucracy's backstage that Marjorie Taylor Greene appeared, alone, stripped of entourage, her heels clicking like bullets on the polished tile. They locked eyes not with surprise but with certainty, as if this collision had been fated long before subpoenas and sound bites. Greene stopped. Her face was flushed, not with the gleam of performance but the heat of humiliation. Her voice when it came was raw, bitter, tinged with something between disbelief and resentment. "How long have you been waiting to humiliate me?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon, unguarded, unscripted, and more honest than anything Greene had said under oath. For a beat, Jasmine said nothing. Her breath was steady. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. Then, with the quiet steel of someone who had carried more than she ever said, she answered, "Since the day you said I wasn't qualified to legislate." Her tone didn't rise, it cut. "I remember every word." There was no press in that hallway, no flashing cameras, just two women, one unraveling, the other resolved, standing in the charged silence between public downfall and private truth. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be, because in that one exchange, the mask of civility was gone, and what was left was a revelation more potent than any headline. This wasn't just about evidence or affidavits or hearings. This was about disrespect turned into resolve. This was what happened when a woman dismissed as unqualified took every insult, every sneer, every whispered dismissal, and turned it into strategy. What neither of them realized in that moment, however, was that a young congressional aide, rushing past with an open laptop bag, had accidentally left his phone recording from a prior interview. The device, still tucked in the side pocket, caught the entire exchange. Hours later, as the Capitol emptied and staff pored over press releases and damage control plans, the audio clip surfaced, unpolished, imperfect, but undeniably real. It began circulating on encrypted press lists, then leaked to political blogs. By midnight, it had gone viral. The audio was raw and brief, just under a minute, but it hit like a confession. Greene's voice, acidic, wounded, cut through the digital feed. "How long have you been waiting to humiliate me?" Then Jasmine, calm and deliberate. "Since the day you said I wasn't qualified to legislate." I remember every word. Comment sections exploded. Some tried to spin it as a petty rivalry. Others knew better, because there, in one unscripted moment, the curtain had fallen on the myth that this was just political theater. What had happened in that hallway wasn't revenge. It was justice sharpened by memory, a reckoning born not from ambition, but from being underestimated one time too many. And for those listening at home, those who had watched Jasmine be talked over, laughed at, sidelined, this wasn't just catharsis. It was clarity. They finally understood. This wasn't a takedown for show. It was a personal line crossed long ago that Jasmine had never forgotten, and now finally had answered. And by dawn, while most of the Capitol still sat in the half-silence of early light and half-drunk coffee, the wheels of consequence had already begun to turn. The hallways that had just 24 hours earlier been buzzing with sound bites and the hum of partisan certainty were now filled with a different kind of energy, one that felt heavier, graver, and irreversible. There was no waiting for the weekend, no quiet backroom negotiations, no lifeline from leadership. At 8:05 a.m., as the orange glare of sunrise streaked through the windows of the Oversight Committee chamber, the emergency vote commenced without ceremony. Members filed in with expressions carved from fatigue and calculation. The chair read the motion clearly and slowly, as if giving the room one final chance to understand the weight of what they were about to do. To refer Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene to the House Ethics Committee for immediate investigation into misconduct, evidence tampering, and obstruction of a congressional process. No one interrupted. No one objected. There were no impassioned defenses or dramatic floor speeches, just a methodical, almost brutal roll call. 13 in favor, 2 opposed. And when the final vote echoed through the room, it was as if a circuit had been severed, a political life support system shut off by those who once powered it. The silence that followed wasn't out of shock. It was from clarity. Everyone knew what had just happened. Greene wasn't simply being investigated. She was being formally disarmed, stripped of the credibility and committee power she had used to push forward her claims and dominate headlines for months. Immediately following the vote, staffers moved quickly. Her nameplates were removed from the glass doors of 3 key subcommittees: election oversight, cyber integrity, and procedural justice. One intern was seen carefully peeling her name off a printed list outside a hearing room, as if removing a piece of tape from something that had once mattered. It wasn't just symbolic, it was procedural. Greene was now barred from reviewing classified evidence, from questioning federal witnesses, from co-signing legislation tied to federal election laws. She had gone from loudest voice in the room to legally silenced observer, stripped of platform, influence, and most importantly, protection. She was nowhere to be seen that morning. No press conference, no fiery tweets, no sidewalk ambushes flanked by red-cap supporters. Her office issued no statements. Her social media feeds went dark. The blinds in her suite on the fourth floor remained drawn tight, even as reporters lined up just beyond the velvet rope, microphones in hand, searching for someone, anyone, who might still be willing to defend her. But no one came forward. Instead, the unraveling took a quieter, more brutal turn. Her closest political allies, those who had once retweeted her, fundraised beside her, stood shoulder to shoulder on Fox News, began to vanish. Not in person, but in pixels. One by one, their public posts disappeared. Endorsement videos were deleted, joint statements evaporated from campaign websites. Images of her standing proudly with other hardliners were scrubbed from timelines without explanation. It was as though she had never existed, or worse, as if she had become something too toxic to even acknowledge. The speed at which it happened was almost surgical. A senator who had previously called Greene a voice the Republican Party desperately needs quietly unlisted their shared podcast episode. A Florida representative who'd once introduced her as the future of our movement suddenly blocked two journalists on Twitter for even asking about her. Her name, once a magnet for MAGA fundraising, was now a PR liability that no consultant wanted to touch. Inside her own office, aides whispered behind closed doors. The few who remained sat rigidly at their desks, heads bowed, as if afraid to meet the eyes of passing colleagues in the hallway. Security was doubled, not for her protection, but to manage the crowd of press who refused to leave until a word, a glance, a single sign of response emerged. Staffers from other offices began joking in hushed tones that Greene's hallway had become the quietest place in Washington. But there was nothing funny about the silence inside. It wasn't peace, it was pressure, the kind that builds just before something breaks. And all the while, Jasmine Crockett continued her day. She didn't comment to the press. She didn't celebrate. She didn't post triumphant videos or wave victory flags. She had no interest in being the face of someone else's downfall. Her goal had never been destruction, it had been accountability. And now, as the walls closed in on the one who had tried to destroy her reputation, Jasmine walked with the unshakable stillness of someone who no longer needed to prove herself. What had once been branded as aggression was now being called courage. What had once been dismissed as disruption was now framed as foresight. She hadn't just uncovered a scandal. She had exposed a structure built on arrogance, protected by silence, and weakened by its own rot. And in doing so, she hadn't just risen. She'd forced the room to reckon with the weight of every time they ignored her voice. Marjorie Taylor Greene, once untouchable in her orbit of controversy, now sat politically paralyzed, not because Jasmine had spoken louder, but because she had spoken truth longer. The vote, the removal, the digital erasure, none of it happened overnight. It had been earned inch by inch, document by document, through resistance that was never publicized and composure that was never praised. But now the nation was watching, and they weren't watching Greene anymore. They were watching the woman who didn't just survive the fire. She lit the match that exposed where the gas lines had been buried all along. And as the political ground settled after one of the most explosive congressional reckonings in recent memory, the cameras turned once more, not toward scandal, but toward the woman who had weathered it with unflinching resolve. Reporters gathered outside the Capitol in numbers not seen since impeachment proceedings, the marble steps flanked by microphones, boom arms, and floodlights that carved the gray sky into a battlefield of questions. It wasn't chaos this time. It was anticipation, the kind of hush that precedes not performance, but purpose. Jasmine Crockett stepped up to the podium, dressed in muted navy, her expression composed, Her shoulders squared beneath the weight of something far heavier than victory. She didn't posture. She didn't rehearse. And when she finally spoke, her voice cut through the noise like it had done in every room where she'd been ignored, dismissed, or underestimated. "I didn't come here to take anyone down," she said, her tone measured, unshaken. "I came here to defend the truth that millions of Americans are entitled to, no matter how inconvenient it is to the powerful, no matter how loud the lies become." The words landed not as an attack, but as a correction, a recentering, as if the building itself had tilted under months of distortion, and this moment was the beginning of setting it upright again. Flashbulbs erupted, but Jasmine didn't flinch. Her hands rested calmly on the podium. Her eyes didn't dart. She wasn't chasing headlines. She was delivering a reminder that truth, no matter how long it's ignored, always finds its way to a microphone. Inside newsrooms across the country, anchors scrambled to cut into scheduled programming. CNN carried the speech live. MSNBC framed it as the pivot point of the year. Even Fox News, caught in its own internal dilemma, couldn't look away. The Chiron beneath Jasmine's image read, "Crockett, I came to defend the truth, not destroy careers." And for the first time, there was no counterspin, just stunned silence, followed by panels of analysts who couldn't agree on much, except this: something had changed. But far from the Capitol, in a dimly lit studio bathed in red backlighting and framed with American flags, Marjorie Taylor Greene responded in kind, but not in truth. With eyes narrowed and voice heavy with practiced indignation, she looked into her camera and hit record. In less than 4 minutes, the clip would be uploaded to her social channels under a now infamous title, "The Witch Hunt They Don't Want You to See." Her message was predictable, her tone unrepentant. "This was never about facts," she said, staring down the lens as if daring her base to question her. "This was a coordinated smear campaign, a political hit job, a Democrat conspiracy, plain and simple." She paused for emphasis, then added, "They can strip me from committees, erase my record, and drag my name through the mud, but they can't silence the movement I represent." The words echoed with bravado, but the video told another story. Her hands trembled slightly. Her eyes darted between notes. The flag behind her drooped slightly, as if the room itself had grown tired of the rhetoric. There were no cheers, no applause, just the echo of a narrative that had finally fractured under the pressure of its own invention. Still, within hours, the clip would circulate widely among her supporters, reaching the fringes where truth was negotiable and victimhood a badge of honor. But even those watching on the far right sensed something had shifted. The usual outrage cycle wasn't moving at full force. Influencers hesitated to repost. Endorsers issued generic statements. Some simply ignored the video altogether, not out of fear, but out of fatigue. Because the truth Jasmine had unleashed wasn't just factual, it was undeniable, and now recorded in the public consciousness. Back on the steps of the Capitol, Jasmine fielded questions with calm authority. One reporter, pushing through the crowd, asked if she felt vindicated. Jasmine paused. She considered her words carefully. Then, without hesitation, she replied, "This was never about me. It's about making sure power doesn't become its own justification. It's about reminding this institution and the people outside of it that facts still matter. And when facts are buried, someone has to be willing to dig them back up." It wasn't grandstanding. It was resolve, spoken with the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting this battle long before cameras showed up. The moment wasn't cinematic. It was real. And that's why it hit so hard. Because for once, the hero wasn't the loudest. She was the last one still standing after the noise had cleared. Even members of Congress who had remained neutral now began releasing statements. Some praised the investigation's outcome. Others admitted that they had ignored warning signs out of political convenience. A few used the moment to pivot their own platforms toward restoring institutional integrity. But behind every statement, every soft retraction, was the unspoken reality. Jasmine Crockett had done what others were too afraid or too comfortable to do. She held the line, and it held. Across social media, her name trended not as a politician, but as a symbol. Hashtags like "Do Your Wife's Truth Over Tactics," "Crockett Courage," and she never folded, began appearing across timelines. Teachers used her hearing as a lesson in civic responsibility. Activists cited her testimony as a model for factual advocacy. Even foreign media outlets picked up the story, framing it as a rare case where democracy didn't just protect itself, it fought back. And in living rooms across the country, in barber shops and school cafeterias, in morning talk shows and nightly podcasts, one truth began to crystallize. Jasmine hadn't destroyed a political opponent. She had exposed a dangerous playbook. She had shown how narratives are built not on truth, but on repetition. How public trust is not stolen, but slowly eroded. And most importantly, she had demonstrated that resistance doesn't always need a megaphone. It just needs discipline, receipts, and the nerve to wait. For those who watched her speak that day, something lingered beyond the headlines. It wasn't just admiration, it was a warning. A signal that the era of unchecked narrative building was cracking, and that from now on, if you twist the truth to climb higher, someone like Jasmine Crockett might be waiting at the top, with the facts, the patience, and the precision to bring the whole thing back down. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't call names. She didn't spike the football. But make no mistake, her victory was total. And in the quiet hours that followed, as Greene's video raged through echo chambers and Jasmine's words played on loop across national broadcasts, the meaning became clear to everyone watching, right, left, or indifferent. This wasn't just a political win, it was a reckoning, and it had a name, Jasmine Crockett. And as the echo of the final headlines faded into static, and the Capitol returned to the rhythm of regular order, a different kind of silence settled across the country. Not the silence of indifference, but of reflection. Jasmine Crockett's name was no longer just a headline or a trending hashtag. It had become something weightier, a symbol etched into the consciousness of a nation that had grown far too used to watching lies win and watching truth get pushed into footnotes. But what stayed behind, long after the clip stopped playing and the tweet stopped trending, was not the scandal she exposed, nor the career she dismantled. It was the cost she had paid to stand where she did, and the clarity she forced upon the country when she did it. Because Jasmine hadn't been handed that podium. She had climbed to it while being pulled down at every turn. The lesson wasn't just in her victory, it was in the path she had to take through mockery, resistance, and systemic condescension to get there. The hours behind closed doors when no one believed her. The moments in committee hearings when her voice was met with eye rolls. Her facts dismissed as political theater. Her calm mistaken for coldness, and her passion mistaken for threat. That wasn't just opposition. That was a system teaching her, over and over again, that the truth is only welcome when it is convenient. And she refused to learn that lesson. She fought to rewrite it. There's a uniquely American myth that truth, when spoken loudly enough, will prevail. But Jasmine's journey proved something more sobering. The truth often doesn't win unless someone is willing to suffer for it. And she did, quietly, repeatedly. While being called a disruptor, a radical, a partisan flamethrower. While being told to wait her turn, to let the process play out, to be less emotional. And through all of that, she remained strategic, grounded, precise. Not because it was easy, but because it was the only way to make herself undeniable in a space built to ignore her. What Jasmine did wasn't heroic in the cinematic sense. There were no triumphant speeches with swelling music. No slow-motion applause. What she did was harder. She told the truth before anyone was ready to hear it, and she kept telling it even when they tried to bury her with it. She didn't strike back out of vengeance. She didn't expose lies to score points. She did it because, at the most basic human level, she understood what it felt like to have truth used against you. And she refused to let anyone else carry that weight alone. That's the lesson so many miss. This was never just about Greene. It wasn't about left versus right. It wasn't even about Congress. It was about the price of integrity in a place where deceit has power and spectacle pays better than substance. It was about the loneliness of being right when everyone around you is comfortable being wrong. Jasmine didn't have the numbers at first. She didn't have the media cycle. She didn't have the institutional allies. All she had was the truth, in the foresight to protect it like a flame in a storm, until the moment came when it could no longer be extinguished. And that's what makes her stand unforgettable. Not just because she held her ground, but because she held it alone until others were forced to see what she had seen all along. She didn't demand validation. She demanded accountability. She didn't ask for applause. She asked for accuracy. And when the lies finally collapsed under the weight of their own contradictions, Jasmine didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. She simply kept doing what she had done from the beginning, holding the line. In a world where it is easier to perform than to persist, Jasmine Crockett persisted. In a culture where rage is easier than restraint, she chose discipline. In an arena built on bending facts into weaponized narratives, she chose to wield evidence like a scalpel, cutting through fiction without losing her humanity. And that, perhaps, is the most profound human lesson of all, that standing for the truth may not reward you quickly. It may not earn you allies. It may not even protect you, but it does something else. It teaches everyone watching that truth can still win, if someone has the endurance to carry it past the noise. She carried it past slander. She carried it past manipulation. She carried it past institutions too afraid to admit they were wrong. And when she laid it bare, in a room built to hide behind process, no one could look away. So what Jasmine Crockett gave us wasn't just a political turning point. She gave us a template for what it looks like to resist not with rage, but with receipts, for what it means to walk through a wall of doubt without losing your direction, and for how to confront a world full of microphones and still say something that lasts. If there's one enduring lesson, one line that deserves to be engraved beyond the headlines, it is this: I didn't come here to take anyone down. I came to defend the truth that millions of Americans are entitled to. And she did. Not because it was easy, because it was necessary. And as Jasmine's closing words echoed into the cold marble corridors of the Capitol, you could feel it, that intangible shift. It wasn't just the end of a hearing, it was the collapse of something rotten and the rise of something long overdue. But truth alone is never enough. Jasmine Crockett's courage, her discipline, her unshakable calm in the face of everything they threw at her, that wasn't the end of the story. It was the spark. A spark that only means something if we carry it forward. Because what Jasmine did, standing in a room that was never built to make space for women like her, refusing to blink while power tried to shout her down, wasn't about personal vindication. It was about principle. And principles, by nature, demand more than applause. They demand action, not later. Now, so if you felt something ignite as she spoke, if you saw in her not just a congresswoman, but a reflection of every time you were told your voice was too much, too soon, too sharp, then this is your moment, too. The line she held, it wasn't drawn in ink. It was carved in effort, in risk, in lonely preparation. And now it needs to be reinforced, not just by people like Jasmine, but by people like you. What does that look like? It starts small. It starts real. It starts with refusing to treat politics like theater and recognizing it as the battleground for what kind of country we actually live in. It starts when you stop scrolling past the lies, when you correct the record in the comments section, at the family dinner table, or in the break room at work. It starts when you call out the silence of those who know better, but say nothing. And it builds when you lift up the voices that have been screaming the truth into the wind for years without a microphone, waiting for someone to listen. If Jasmine's story taught us anything, it's this: you don't need permission to speak the truth. You need preparation, you need endurance, and you need the grit to keep speaking even when no one listens, especially then, because the machine only wins when the noise drowns out the facts, when fatigue replaces vigilance, when spectacle replaces substance. But now you've seen what happens when the noise collapses, when the receipts speak louder than the rage, when one woman, backed into a corner, doesn't fold, but fights smart, fights long, fights clean. And when that happens, the whole system stutters, because they never expect the quiet ones to be so ready. So this is the ask, not for your admiration. Jasmine doesn't need that. She already won. The ask is for your vigilance, your pressure, your voice, your memory. Because this system is built to forget. It moves on fast. It counts on you moving with it. But if we let this story fade into yesterday's news, then nothing changes. Greene will not be the last to lie boldly into the mic, and Jasmine won't be the last to risk everything to stop it. So remember what this felt like. The stillness when the truth hit the screen, the way the noise stopped, the way the ground seemed to shift under Greene's feet. Not because she was shouted down, but because she was finally undeniably revealed. And remember, that didn't happen because a system corrected itself. It happened because a woman refused to let the system keep pretending it didn't know. So what happens next isn't Jasmine's burden, it's ours. We build on what she started. We guard the truth she exposed. We fund and vote and show up not for charisma, but for competence with conscience. We teach our children not just how to speak, but how to listen for the quiet, steady voices holding the line. And we promise, that the next time someone like Jasmine walks into a room full of smirks and smokescreens, they won't walk in alone. We walk in with them. We speak in chorus. We remember that the strongest voices are not always the loudest. They are the ones that still speak when silence would be safer. So let this moment do more than echo. Let it move you. Let it call you. Let it remind you that truth doesn't live in institutions. It lives in people who are willing to risk everything to defend it. And if you're still reading this, then maybe you're one of them. Maybe you've always been. You just needed to see it done. Now go do it, not for Jasmine, with her, because what she started, we finish. But don't mistake this for the end of a story. It's not. It's the first step in a longer, harder fight. One that doesn't take place in front of microphones, but in school board meetings, local elections, courtroom benches, and quiet conversations where culture is shaped long before policies are written. Jasmine's stand lit the signal flare, but the battle she exposed is still alive. In voter suppression laws tucked into bureaucracy, in disinformation pipelines dressed up as patriotism, and in the casual dismissals of voices that don't fit the mold of respectability. That's where you come in. The next Jasmine may not have a national stage. She might be a young woman in a city council race who's being told she's too inexperienced. She might be a teacher standing up against a banned book list. She might be an election worker receiving death threats because she refused to falsify numbers. She might be someone in your own neighborhood who isn't asking for praise. Just a little backup when the world gets loud and cruel. You have more power than you think. Democracy is not something fragile that needs to be wrapped in glass. It is something muscular that needs to be exercised. That means showing up when it's inconvenient, defending facts when it's unpopular, and pushing for accountability even when the headlines have moved on. The world doesn't change because the truth is known. It changes because people refuse to let it be ignored. That is the real legacy Jasmine forged, not just in what she exposed, but in what she dared everyone watching to remember. You don't have to be part of the machine to challenge it. You just have to be willing to lose comfort in exchange for clarity. You have to be willing to be the only one standing, trusting that the evidence will catch up. And when the moment comes, as it did for Jasmine, you'll be ready, not because someone handed you a script, but because you never stopped writing your own. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.